Everyone. My name is Dr. Liz Laugesen, and I am the training director of the UCLA Tarjan Center. If you're new to our lecture series, by way of background, the Tarjan Center is a university center for excellence in developmental disabilities. And on behalf of the Tarjan Center and our co-sponsors, the UCLA Center for Autism Research and Treatment and the UCLA Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Research Center, we'd like to begin by welcoming you all to our first lecture of the 2021 year. So a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. This lecture will be held from 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time with a 5 to 10 minute Q&A at the end of the hour. Now, if you have any questions for our speaker, feel free to send them through the Q&A link, which can be found on your Zoom toolbar. We will not be using the chat, so you'll want to use the Q&A link. Also, you'll be provided with a link to complete a speaker evaluation at the end of this presentation. So we'll hope that you'll take a few minutes to complete that survey for all of us so we can get your feedback. But without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. Christine Moody. Dr. Moody is a clinical psychology postdoctoral fellow at UCLA with a joint appointment at the UCLA Peers Clinic and the UCLA Ties for Families program. Dr. Moody earned her doctorate in clinical psychology from UCLA under the mentorship of Dr. Bruce Baker, with a specialization in therapeutic and assessment services for children and their families. Now, her research interests focus on identifying factors that promote positive outcomes for young people with neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability. Now, she's especially passionate about the importance of mental health and positive relationships for these youth and has over 11 years of experience working with individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders in a variety of clinical and research settings. And in her postdoctoral position, Dr. Moody continues to provide therapeutic services to individuals and families while also pursuing research that informs clinical practice. And it's certainly my great pleasure to work with her and to have the privilege of introducing her today. We're very fortunate to learn more about her research on mental health and social support during the transition to adulthood for individuals with autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability. So with that, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome Dr. Christine Moody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laugesen, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here by Zoom. I'm excited to talk to you about some exciting new research examining the role of mental health and social support in the transition to adulthood for individuals with intellectual and neurodevelopmental disorders. So to start with a little background, the transition to adulthood is increasingly being recognized as a distinct developmental period. It's most often defined as 18 to 24 years old, and it is a period when individuals are figuring things out, whether that be employment or higher education or dating or where they will live. Young adults are working towards increased independence, but may not yet be taking on traditional adult roles, such as having job stability, getting married, having children. And societal trends have accentuated this period even more as young adults take more time after high school before settling down. As such, this period is categorized by continued identity development and exploration, as young adults may explore various paths, careers, and relationships. This exploration results in a group that is diverse in pathways and trajectories that bring them to adulthood. And in fact, this demographic period has been described as the one period in life in which nothing is normative. From a systems perspective, characteristics of the person, such as neurobiology or gender, and characteristics of the environment or context, whether that be family relationships, school quality, culture, interact with one another to produce outcomes and trajectories. And there's wide support for the importance of these person-context interactions. And from this lens, the transition period can be viewed as especially salient, given that there's many changes that occur at this time, both within the individual, brain maturation, identity development, and in their environment. So leaving high school, moving out of the family home, a change in role from student to employee, perhaps. This theoretical framework helps us understand how and why there are such varied pathways and trajectories and outcomes within young adulthood. And it also points to the transition to adulthood period as a critical juncture where things can change very quickly for the better or for the worse. For individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism spectrum disorder or intellectual disability, this critical juncture may be even more pronounced. As these individuals exit the public school system, they lose the extensive services afforded to them through IDEA, and adult services are less widely available and become harder to access. As such, many young adults with neurodevelopmental disorders, or ND, face what has been deemed a service cliff, and research shows drastic decline in service use after these individuals leave high school, with, for example, almost half of young adults with autism spectrum disorder not receiving any services at all in the 2 years after high school. Further, the psychological experience during the transition may be fundamentally different for individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders. One small study found individuals with intellectual disability have significantly different concerns than typically developing young adults during the transition to adulthood. Individuals with intellectual disability reported worries about losing a caretaker or failing at life, while the typically developing sample reported worries about getting a job. Individuals with intellectual disability were more distressed by their worries and were more likely to ruminate about them. These differences in the psychological experience exist across the spectrum of neurodevelopmental disorders, with young adults with ASD who are enrolled at a 4-year university reporting severe levels of stress at a rate 5 times higher than typical college students. This background helps us understand the pervasively poor outcomes we see for persons with neurodevelopmental disorders during the transition to adulthood, where more than half of young adults with ASD and/or ID are not participating in higher education or employment in the years following high school. More than half report significant mental health problems, and they have significantly fewer social relationships than their typically developing peers. Focusing in briefly on mental health, we know that mental health is a significant public health problem for all young adults. A recent epidemiological study documented that 25% of young adults in the general population were diagnosed with a mental health or diagnosable with a mental health or substance abuse disorder in the past 12 months. This represents an increase in prevalence relevant to adolescents, and there were no differences observed in college versus non-college samples. There's also significant evidence of unmet mental health service needs, such that 40% of young adults experiencing depressive symptoms and suicidality had not yet accessed any mental health services. As you'd expect, these mental health problems are interfering. Those with mental health problems are significantly more likely to not be engaged in employment, education, or training, a classification called NEAT. And those that are engaged in those activities are at risk for dropping out, failing, or resorting to maladaptive coping while dealing with mental health struggles. Ultimately, these mental health problems in young adulthood have been shown to have long-term negative consequences on individuals' later financial security and earnings potential as well. Research has documented that the rates of mental health problems are even higher in neurodevelopmental disorder populations. And though estimates vary, here are a couple of numbers pulled from adult samples. So 75% of adults with autism spectrum disorder having clinically elevated mental health symptoms, and 50% of adults with intellectual disability. As you can see, these numbers are substantially higher than the 25% reported in the general population, and thus provide further evidence to support that mental health may be an important factor in the poor outcomes observed in neurodevelopmental populations during the transition to adulthood. And though that makes logical sense, the role of mental health on neurodevelopmental transition outcomes has not yet been thoroughly explored in research. So turning now to social support, the other focus of our studies, social support is defined as the availability of helping relationships and the quality of those relationships. And we know in the general population, social support has been reliably linked to psychological and physical outcomes. and identified as a protective buffer as well, such that it mitigates the relationship between negative life events and stress and other poor outcomes. Importantly, social support is multidimensional. And so there's many ways to dismantle social support. You can make the distinction between perceived or felt social support and objective or received social support. You can compare the size of one's networks or the type of people that are in it, as well as the availability of different kinds of support. So for example, the people who might give you a ride to the airport, a form of practical support, might be different than the people who you might talk to about your worries or your accomplishments or relationship problems, which is a form of emotional support. This multidimensionality is important, as previous research has demonstrated that different components of social support relate more or less strongly to different outcomes. And so though there is a large literature on social support in the general population and adults as a whole, social support is much less understood in neurodevelopmental disorder populations. Large focus of the literature has been on the social support of mothers or caregivers of those with such neurodevelopmental disorders, which is definitely important. However, less attention has been paid to the social support networks of those with neurodevelopmental disorders themselves. From findings of limited studies that have looked at this, results suggest that adults with neurodevelopmental disorders have smaller networks than typically developing adults, as well as compared to other groups, such as those with ADHD or physical disability. And young adults with neurodevelopmental disorders have a higher reliance on professionals for social support as compared to other groups, lower reliance on friends, and report overall less satisfaction and lower levels of connection with their social support members as compared to other groups. However, social support has emerged as an important correlate of quality of life in adults with autism spectrum disorder in just a couple of studies that have looked at this. And however, those studies are largely limited in their use of assessments that only indirectly capture social support or don't capture the multidimensionality of it. These studies further emphasize the need to examine these variables in ND populations. And in young adulthood particularly, the presence of such social support may be particularly essential and protective given the rapid transitions and potential stressors. So, though the research clearly shows that transition outcomes are poor in neurodevelopmental disorder populations, factors that correlate with or predict successful transitions also have not been reliably established. And individual level disability characteristics such as IQ, language level, autism symptom severity, adaptive behavior are the most widely studied predictors thus far. And in general, these variables show relationships in the expected directions. For example, those with greater ASD symptom severity may fare worse in young adulthood. Yet even here, there are some mixed findings, and to me, that suggests that we're missing an important piece of the puzzle. One notable meta-analytic finding is that these disability characteristics appear to be related to quality of life in children, but not in adults with developmental disabilities, which further suggests we're missing a piece of the puzzle. And overall, there's a glaring absence of the investigation of contextual factors that are theoretically important to trajectories and outcomes, and exploration of such environmental and systems factors has been labeled as an overarching research priority by the Healthcare Transitions Research Network for Autism Spectrum Disorder and Other Developmental Disabilities. Another absence is the lack of consideration of the impact of psychopathology on functioning. So ultimately, as mental health problems and comorbid psychiatric disorders in and of themselves result in functional impairments, it's highly probable that the presence of mental health problems is a risk factor associated with increased likelihood of poor young adult outcomes. Several papers have concluded that comorbid psychopathology does differentiate young adults with better outcomes than those with more poor outcomes in both typically developing and neurodevelopmental disorder populations. However, this variable is rarely considered longitudinally in ND populations, and with a recent review identifying only one study that had collected mental health data in both childhood and adulthood. So in sum, that brings us to the research that we'll be discussing today, where I'll be focusing on social emotional factors and their role in transition outcomes for young adults with neurodevelopmental disorders, and comparing that to their role for typically developing young adults. So for these studies, we reached out to families who participated in a former multi-site study here at UCLA, UC Riverside, and Penn State University called the Collaborative Family Study. These families have children with typical development, intellectual disability, or autism spectrum disorder, and had participated in research several times when the children were younger. In this follow-up study, the children had grown up and were now on average age 22. And the data I will be reporting on is on the first 93 young adults and their families who participated. We're continuing recruitment, but of those first 93, 49 were in either of the neurodevelopmental disorder groups, so autism or intellectual disability. So here are some demographic characteristics of those who participated in the young adult follow-up. I've split the sample into 4 different groups here, so typically developing autism spectrum disorder with no cognitive impairments, autism spectrum disorder with comorbid intellectual disability, and those with intellectual disability alone. So as you'd expect, there's substantial differences in IQ and adaptive behavior across the groups. Our ASD group had a significantly higher proportion of males than the other groups, consistent with gender differences. No differences were observed in ethnicity, age, or income across groups at this time point. To collect data, we had young adults and their parents complete questionnaires online and participate in semi-structured interviews with graduate students. And we asked the autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability sample, those young adults, to come into our research centers in person so that we could support them as they did their questionnaires and adapt any questions as needed to enable their comprehension. Typically, developing young adults and all parents completed their assessments by phone and online. So here's a table of all the measures I will be using from the young adult follow-up data collection point. The first is a broad-based functional outcome that I'll describe more in depth later. The next measure is quality of life, followed by our mental health measure, the ABCL and ASR, which is the adult version of the CBCL, and YSR for those that are familiar with that. And the last 2 assess different dimensions of social support. So we also use data from the adolescent time points, which were collected at age 13 and 15 to identify predictors of young adult outcomes. And although, like I said, this hasn't been looked at in depth before, we don't know what social, emotional, and system factors predict young adult outcomes in individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders. We targeted plausible relational predictors by looking at correlates of outcomes in childhood and adolescence and in adults with typical development. So these 5 domains, mental health, parenting, student-teacher relationships, peer relationships, and self-efficacy, show a substantial body of research supporting their importance to outcomes, many of which have research evidence supporting the longevity of their effects over multiple years in childhood, and their predictive value in both TD and ND populations. Okay, so let's see. So just going a little bit more deeply into that functional outcome, the transition outcome composite that I mentioned earlier, because this research is founded on creating a better understanding of the correlates and predictors of outcomes seen in neurodevelopmental disorder populations in young adulthood, we first wanted to see how our young adults were doing in the transition period more broadly. To do that, we created a transition outcome composite. We call it the TOC. The TOC is based on composite measures previously used in the ASD literature. It's a sum of 3 domains, so professional, independent living, and social functioning, that are each rated on a 0 to 3 scale and take into account both parent and self-report of these domains. So we'll start by examining the results using the transition outcome composite to set the stage for how our young adults are doing in the transition to adulthood. And then we'll move into our specific mental health and social support analyses. Okay. So when breaking the composite into classification domains, as has been done in the previous literature, you can see that for typically developing young adults, the vast majority of these young adults fall in the good or very good range. In contrast, the majority of the intellectual disability and ASD groups fall in the fair or poor ranges. There was some specificity in the domains that each group struggled in, such that we saw that people in the intellectual disability group were relatively less likely to be meaningfully involved in professional activities, while the autism spectrum group struggled more so in the social relationships domain, as would be expected, given the nature of the disorder. So together, it makes sense that young adults with both diagnoses, ASD and comorbid intellectual disability, fared worst on this functional outcome, with none falling in the good range and the majority falling in the poor range. Ultimately, consistent with previous literature, these results continue to emphasize that young adults with neurodevelopmental disorders continue to be at risk for poor transition outcomes, which may not be surprising to some of you in the audience today who may be experiencing these struggles yourself, advocating or searching for supports that your child needs, or working with clients who are facing these challenges. All right, so in our specific examination of mental health, we first aimed to examine concurrent relationships between mental health problems and functional outcomes, as well as the relationship between mental health and quality of life. The second aim was to identify adolescent predictors of young adult mental health. And we examined diagnostic status as a moderator of those relationships, given that previous evidence shows that environmental and contextual factors may exert stronger influences on children with neurodevelopmental disorders. So preliminary results using a chi-square test show that parents of young adults with neurodevelopmental disorders were significantly more likely to endorse clinically elevated mental health problems. 35% of parents with young adults with neurodevelopmental disorders rated their child in the elevated range, as compared to only 8% of parents of typically developing young adults. This is self-reported mental health symptoms, and it shows a similar picture where young adults in the ND groups were significantly more likely to self-report themselves as falling in the clinical range of mental health problems. And you may notice that for both groups here, more young adults self-report themselves in the clinical range than did their parents. This suggests that parents may not have a full insight into their children's experiences at this age, and it's important to hear from the young adult themselves. Our first aim relating mental health to concurrent broad young adult outcomes, we created a 3-level diagnostic status variable, TD, typically developing ASD and ID, and then utilized ANCOVAs with diagnostic status internalizing and externalizing problems entered into the model, looking at 2 of which utilizing the functional outcome of the TOC as the outcome in the model, and then 2 of which utilizing overall quality of life on the QOL on the right, and then we ran each with parent and self-report. So this was one of the few areas where we found some significant interactions by diagnostic status. So on the bottom left, you'll see that for young adults with ASD, there was a significant relationship between internalizing symptoms and functional outcome. So this was only seen though for the autism group. In contrast, on the top right, parent-reported externalizing problems related to young adult self-reported quality of life, but only for typically developing young adults. Overall, though, as you can see here, internalizing problems was the most consistently significant factor. So internalizing problems are things like anxiety and depression, and suggesting that those with those types of symptoms also have worse functional outcomes as well as lower quality of life. Even more notable is that after accounting for mental health problems, diagnostic status does not contribute over and above in explaining self-reported quality of life in these young adults. Again, further underscoring that mental health factors are an important piece in understanding transition outcomes and may even be more salient than the diagnosis itself. So for our second aim of predicting young adult mental health from adolescence, we ran 4 separate ANCOVAs with different predictors. And each of them we included mental health and previous mental health in adolescence and diagnostic status. And then we entered the predictors and the interaction terms, which were removed for parsimony if they were non-significant. So as you can see, this is the first 2 terms of the model with parenting behaviors, which I'll show the effect of that in the next slide. But I just want to highlight that previous mental health in adolescence is significant, as well as diagnostic status, suggesting some level of continuity in mental health problems over time, as well as continued discrepancies by diagnostic group. So for parenting behaviors specifically, no interactions emerged, suggesting that the nature of the relationship was similar for all diagnostic groups. And after removing the interaction terms, negative parenting approached significance, while positive parenting did not predict young adult mental health. When positive parenting is removed from the model, negative parenting becomes significant, such that negative parenting behaviors such as being intrusiveness, negative affect, as those types of behaviors increased, self-reported total mental health problems in young adulthood also increased, over and above previous mental health and diagnostic status. We found no effect for student-teacher relationships, such that student-teacher relationships did not emerge as a significant predictor of young adult mental health for any of the diagnostic groups. Looking at peer relationships now, no interactions were significant here, and so they were removed. And in looking at main effects, we saw that bullying emerged as a significant predictor of young adult mental health, such that more experiences of victimization in adolescence corresponded to poor later mental health in all groups. In contrast, peer acceptance was not significant. So finally, hope in adolescence was also emerged as a significant predictor for all diagnostic groups, over and above the other variables in the model. Interestingly, this variable held the most explanatory power, such that the R-squared is greatest in this model. So 41% of the variance in young adult mental health was explained by these 3 factors. So that was a whole bunch of numbers, but what are some takeaways about mental health? Consistent with the prior literature, young adults with neurodevelopmental disorders are at elevated risk for psychopathology. Our results indicate that this is driven more so by elevations in internalizing problems such as anxiety and depression. And unfortunately for these young adults, it's also the case that internalizing problems appear to be more strongly associated with functional impairments and diminished quality of life. This may suggest, as hypothesized, that elevated mental health problems are one explanatory factor for the poor young adult outcomes in ND populations. Finally, another takeaway is surrounding the long-lasting impact of adolescent relational factors. These findings point to the particular predictive potency of negative experiences in adolescence, including experiencing parents who are displaying negative parenting behaviors and victimization by peers. The emergence of hope as a predictor also calls for increased investigation into this variable and how interventions may be able to improve hope as in adolescence as a way to change those mental health trajectories. So moving on to our second focus, social support. The first aim was simply to report group differences using a multi-dimensional approach of social support. And then the second aim was to connect these social support characteristics to concurrent young adult outcomes similar to study 1, focusing on mental health. The third aim was also to identify those adolescent predictors and to see if they're different for different groups. So looking at just total network size, so these are the young adults reported on the people that provide them different types of social support. And so we looked at the total network size that they reported. We saw no significant differences by diagnostic status in the total number of distinct people listed in their networks. Though quantitatively, you can see that young adults with ASD had slightly smaller networks. Surprisingly, young adults with ID had remarkably similar networks, size networks to those with typical development. There were also no significant differences by group in the number of family members listed or the number of professionals listed. However, there was a significant effect of diagnostic status in the number of friends listed in their networks. Specifically, young adults with ASD reported significantly fewer friends as providing them with any kind of social support. You can see here the number of friends that the young adults with ASD reported on average is actually less than half of their typically developing peers. And so though the raw numbers did not differ for family members, there was a significant difference in proportionality, such that family members made up a larger proportion of the support networks of those with ASD, seen here on the right, as compared to typically developing on the left. Young adults with intellectual disability fell somewhere in the middle and were not significantly different from either group. A similar picture is seen in perceived social support measured by the ISL. So this is kind of how much social support one feels that they have, such that the ASD group in blue reported significantly lower perceptions of their available total support, of their appraisal support, which is similar to emotional support, and also of their belonging support, which is whether you feel like you have people to do things with, like go to the movies or go for a walk. In looking at the relationship between these social support characteristics and young adult outcomes, we looked at network size as well as the perceptions of social support, representing like an objective and subjective dimension of social support, and related those to the transition outcome composite, that functional outcome. So here the relationship was similar for all groups, and we found that network size related to functional outcome, but perceived social support did not. So we found that those that had more people in their support networks had better functional outcomes. And we looked specifically at the different components of the TOC. So having a larger network size predicted professional involvement rating. So that was involvement in education or employment, as well as the social rating in the TOC. So we also looked at binary logistic regression to test whether network size or perceived social support related to increased risk of falling in the clinically elevated range for mental health problems in young adulthood. And here we found that perceived support did relate to self-reported internalizing problems with no interaction, so a universal effect for all groups, TD, ID, and ASD. The result indicated that with every 1 point increase in the ISL, so more perceived social support, the odds of falling in the clinically elevated range for internalizing problems were reduced by 17%, so that's a pretty big difference. And in contrast, network size did not relate here, and no significant findings when using externalizing problems emerged. So our final aim for study 2 was predicting social support outcomes. And so we put in diagnostic status, adolescent hope, and then adolescent internalizing and externalizing problems as rated by parents on the CBCL as predictors of young adult social support. And so we looked at belonging, appraisal, friends, and family in their networks. So this is the model for predicting number of family members. And we did see here that adolescents who had higher externalizing symptomatology later had fewer family members in their support networks. There was no interaction for this effect, so that suggests that it was true for typically developing young adults as well as young adults with neurodevelopmental disorders. In predicting the number of friends in one's network, we didn't find any significant results. And then here, looking for predicting perceived belonging support or companionship support, we found that higher hope in adolescence was significantly predictive. So feeling as though those that had higher hope in adolescence are more likely to feel as though they have someone to do leisure activities with. Even more notable here, diagnostic status is not significant in the model, and hope is carrying the majority of the explanatory power here. So what do we take away from these findings? So it's interesting that unlike prior research, we found no difference in social support network size by diagnostic group. This may be a function of our smaller sample size, and thus maybe we didn't have enough power to detect a smaller effect, but it also may represent cohort effects. Maybe there's been improvements in the network size of young adults with neurodevelopmental disorders over time. Or more troubling, maybe typically developing young adults are becoming more isolated over time. Although there were no differences in network size, in looking at other dimensions of social support characteristics, it was clear that the autism spectrum group was uniquely at risk as compared to the typically developing young adults, both in terms of number of friends, but also with how much support they feel they have. Our analyses show that the number of friends in one's network does contribute to young adults' perceptions of their social support, so these two deficits may be linked as well. But the deficits in perceived social support are especially troubling given past research showing that perception is a more potent protective factor than the more objective measures of social support. And finally, our findings again support that examining social support as a multidimensional construct is important, as the different dimensions of social support related to different outcomes. Young adults across all diagnostic groups who reported more people in their social support networks achieved greater functional success. This may be an indicator that additional people in one's networks may make involvement in higher education or paid employment more accessible or feasible, whether it's through enhanced networking connections, job coaching or advice, or just additional practical support. In contrast, perceived support, especially perceived belonging, related to mental health outcomes, while objective network size did not have any significant association with mental health problems. Low perceptions of belonging may contribute to diminished self-worth, which is a symptom of depression, or exacerbate anxiety symptoms related to negative social evaluation. The lack of a significant interaction with diagnostic status suggested that perceived belonging is an important correlate of mental health for all young adults. And even more notable in these models, differences by diagnostic status were no longer significant, providing evidence that suggests that higher rates of internalizing problems in neurodevelopmental disorder populations may be better attributed to reduced feelings of social belonging and not just the presence of a neurodevelopmental disorder. Further, each social support component was predicted by different factors. Hope was predictive of perceived social support later. And given that hope as a construct represents both the ability to find multiple ways to solve a problem and the ability to take action towards one's goals, it's possible that adolescents with higher hope have found different ways or were persistent in fostering social support over time. Or even just that having higher levels of hope colors their outlook in young adulthood in responding to measures of perceived social support, such that they perceive more options available to them. They are more able to creatively find ways to solve a problem of who to go to the movies with. Interestingly, though, neither mental health nor hope in adolescents predicted number of friends in one's young adult social support network. For adolescents who struggle with making and keeping friends in that time period in adolescence, this is a positive sign, suggesting that there may not be long-term negative impacts on mental health problems on future friendship networks. The predictive power on these outcomes may be diminished by social changes brought by starting new jobs or going to college that create fresh opportunities for friendship. And we do see, however, that adolescent mental health plays a role in the more contextually stable members of one's network, so family members, where adolescents who exhibit higher externalizing behaviors such as aggression and rule breaking has significantly fewer family members in their networks. It's possible that these challenging behaviors, serve to isolate themselves from family members, an extended family through exclusion or isolation. So bringing it all together, our last few minutes before we go to questions. We see a replication of findings that show relatively poor transition to adulthood outcomes for young adults with neurodevelopmental disorders relative to typically developing populations. And these disparities seem to be more pronounced in ASD than they are in ID-only populations. We also see that relational and mental health variables in adolescence and young adulthood display pervasive connections to transition outcomes. They matter. And despite the presence of group differences in these outcome measures, it was striking how few interactions were identified in the relationships and processes tested. By and large, the results of this research suggest that there is a broad universality in the correlates and predictors of successful transitions to adulthood. It's also true, though, that previous research shows that youth with neurodevelopmental disorders are more likely to experience those risk factors that have been identified by our results today. So they're more likely to experience bullying and victimization, more likely to have lower hope, diminished social support, elevated mental health problems. So as such, in understanding transition outcomes for individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders, it may be more helpful to focus on understanding how these multiple risk factors culminate to produce an environment in which success during the transition period becomes increasingly difficult to access for individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders. And although that's somewhat of a grim picture to paint with looking at the coalescence of those risk factors for youth and young adults with neurodevelopmental disorders, there's also a vast potential for effective interventions here. Each of the factors identified in this research today are amenable to change and have been shown to be responsive to intervention. This is in contrast to previous literature that has focused on less characteristics that are less amenable to change, like IQ, language ability, autism symptom severity. And so change is possible here, but we need more widely available evidence-based interventions, mental health interventions adapted for youth and young adults with ASD and ID, interventions to reduce bullying and increase friendships for those with neurodevelopmental disorders, parenting programs for parents of adolescents, not just little ones, adolescents with neurodevelopmental disorders, and perhaps a new target of intervening and improving hope. So lastly, acknowledging some limitations of the current study and also looking at future directions for research, I think the first future direction would be replicating these findings with a larger sample, especially one that has adequate numbers to enable comparison across the 4 possible diagnostic groupings. So we did 3 diagnostic groupings in our analyses, but you could separate them into 4. So looking at ASD with no cognitive impairment and ASD with comorbid intellectual disability. And that would provide the best insight into how different neurodevelopmental disorder populations may differ from each other. We have been continuing to recruit for this follow-up study and are continuing to increase our sample. So we'll see where we get with that. Another option would be to explore using missing data analysis approaches like FIML to maximize power in those longitudinal analyses. It's also worthwhile considering the impact of parent and self-report. So we used a self-report a bit more in the studies I presented today. And I do think it's important for future research to really delve into whether and how reporting varies systematically by informant, by diagnosis, by IQ, by content of the questions. These are complicated questions, not easily answered, but point to the need to collect both parent and self-report in research and clinical work. Another way to bolster validity would be to gather complementary qualitative data. For example, in our ratings of the transition outcome composite, where we integrated both parent and self-report, we also consulted the interviews that we did and the transcriptions to resolve discrepancies between parent and self-report. And that was very helpful in fully understanding the complete picture of the young adults world. Another future direction would be to replicate these findings in more diverse samples. Though we did have some variability in income and ethnicity, I would say on the whole, the sample was higher income and it was majority Caucasian. So it's possible that the mechanisms or strength of these effects would vary by ethnicity or income. It also would be interesting to oversample females with ASD to see if these effects are similar or different for that population. And finally, as I mentioned before, I see vast potential for continuing to develop and disseminate evidence-based interventions to change these trajectories and improve these outcomes in young adulthood for those with neurodevelopmental disorders. And so that brings me to the end of my presentation. And before we jump into question and answers, I'd love to acknowledge my mentors on this study, so Dr. Bruce Baker and Dr. Jan Blaster, as well as the whole collaborative family study team. And I'd like to thank everyone here today for your attention, engagement, and support throughout. So without further ado, I'd love to hear some questions. And so I think Dr. Lageson will be moderating our question and answering.
Yes, thank you so much to Dr. Moody for that really interesting, I think very thought-provoking talk. So many different directions to go with this research. We do have a number of questions. Just for those of you that would like to send a question to Dr. Moody, remember that you can do that through the Q&A feature on your Zoom toolbar. We're not using the chat for questions. So the first question that came in was from Dr. Emily Wood, and she asks, if more negative parenting decreases youth mental health, but there was no relationship between positive parenting and mental health, does this mean that these kids would just be better off left alone?
I think that it's more complicated than that. I definitely think I'm a proponent of positive parenting, however, our measurements of parenting are not as complex as parenting itself is. And so, our measurement of negative parenting, that intrusiveness, negative use of negative affect, and then positive parenting was measured using measure of sensitivity, promotion of interest in learning, positive affect. It doesn't capture limit setting, healthy limit setting. So that's something that I think definitely is important as a positive parenting characteristic. I do think there is something, so there's some research in other fields, like in romantic relationship fields, that negative interactions are more potent or more powerful or have a greater impact than the positive interactions. And so they say, for every negative comment in a romantic relationship, you need to have 7, I think, positive, interactions to make up for it. So it's also possible that the the effect of negative parenting, you know, has just a more potency that maybe lasts longer, or has a longer impact. And so I wonder about that as well, that positive parenting has a strong connection in the moment, or that there needs to be a greater quality of positive parenting behaviors to kind of adjust or balance any presence of negative parenting behaviors.
Yeah, complicated question, but interesting, thoughts. Thank you for your response there. So we also have a kind of a two-part question from David Reed. He's asking, is there a way to foster greater hope in ourselves and others as ASD adults transitioning into adulthood? And then kind of following up with that, given that the STR wasn't a significant factor, is it worth investing in relationships with teachers or professors as a part of the social support network?
Well, so fostering greater hope. So there are some, not in neurodevelopmental disorder populations, but there are some studies looking at interventions that target hope and show that it's responsive to even short-term interventions that can be done, you know, in a few weeks. So I definitely think that there's great potential there to improve hope. The construct of hope is really about believing in oneself, that you can make goals and sustain action towards your goals and achieve goals. So in thinking about ways to foster kind of on your own, you know, I would think about, you know, setting goals for yourself, being creative around problem solving. If you hit a setback, you know, knowing that if this approach didn't work, let me try a different approach to reach this goal. Even setting smaller goals, you know, to increase that sense of achievement and feasibility, you know, in taking action and succeeding in one's goals, that could also foster hope. So those are some things that come to my mind around fostering hope. Also, setting those SMART goals. I don't know if anyone's heard of those, but specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time limited. So, you know, looking at kind of really in this next week, I will exercise twice, you know, being really specific around that and time limited. In terms of the student-teacher relationships, so importantly, in our study, we looked at student-teacher relationships in adolescence, and it did not emerge as predictive of outcomes in young adulthood. So that does not say to me that it's not worth investing in, because student-teacher relationships in young adulthood could be really powerful. We didn't look at that in this study, but relationships with professors in college for young adults could be very protective in their mental health and their well-being and their functional outcomes. We also know that student-teacher relationships concurrently for children with neurodevelopmental disorders are also impactful. So perhaps maybe more what the findings say is that the student-teacher relationships may not have as of a long-term across developmental periods effect in these populations as we thought they might.
All right, well, thank you for that. We have lots of positive comments coming in through the Q&A. The next question is from Dr. Shula Green. She says, Christine, great talk. She has two related questions. Maybe we'll start with the first one. Do you have a sense, maybe from your own clinical experience, of what aspects of the transition to adulthood are more likely to exacerbate these mental health symptoms? And are there any environmental changes that could be made that would help ease the transition?
Yeah, so, you know, in doing these interviews with these young adults and their parents, you know, I think a lot of families pointed to that service cliff, that feeling of all of a sudden high school is done and they didn't know what they were going to do, or how they were going to, what the next step was, figuring out going to community college or employment or some kind of a day program. So we spoke to them around age 22, and so some of our young adults were recently transitioning out of the public school system. Some had transitioned out closer to, age 18. But most of them said that it took them, about a year or so to get kind of settled, to get something lined up, to get the schedule or education set up. So that's something I think that planning in high school, that those individualized transition plans, ITPs, are really, really important, I think, for families and young adults in kind of navigating and preparing. I think there needs to be a greater emphasis on exploring, and planning for that transition, that would make it, that would ease the transition and be protective against, those feelings of confusion or feelings of even failure, not having, not having a job or not being enrolled in college when you see your peers are. So that's how I'd answer the first question.
Yeah, really good point. I mean, the autism services cliff, that's an issue really globally, I think, and we're just not preparing our youth for transitioning into adulthood. So good points there. The second question that Dr. Green had was, what are your recommendations for clinicians working with young adults on mental health challenges, especially if they do not have positive parenting supports available?
Well, I definitely think finding other sources of social support is very, very important. And so, I'm affiliated with the UCLA Peers Clinic. And so the Peers program, we have Peers for Young Adults, which has shown, has research evidence to support that it increases friendships and connections. So that's something that I would recommend referring potentially to a peers provider as a supplement to, individual mental health interventions, because we know that social support is related to mental health and transition outcomes per this research. So in terms of, I would say that, and then second, I would say, targeting mental health in these young adults, so, as we would, with some adaptations for, similar to as we would for typically developing young adults. I think sometimes the, depression and anxiety symptoms are overlooked or overshadowed by the autism diagnosis. And so making sure that, you're screening and attending, which I know that Dr. Green is, to those symptoms and treating them as well as, the treating autism symptoms.
All right, thank you for that. Another question begins with great presentation, Christine. Have a question on whether screening for adversity was done and if that impacted their transition process.
That's a great question. And I'm assuming a little bit what the questioner means by adversity, but we did not screen for kind of early childhood adverse experiences or, those ACEs is what's coming to mind. I don't know, adverse childhood experiences. We did not screen for those particularly. We do have some data, from, there's a longitudinal study. So we have some data on like whether these children's parents were divorced at any point, but we don't have, a formal screening of that. I definitely do think it would impact their transition process. Those adverse childhood experiences, there's such a wealth of research in the general population showing that it does have these long-term effects on, into adulthood, on adult outcomes. And the results of this research today really show that, those with neurodevelopmental disorders are a lot, the processes and risk factors and protective factors are really similar. And so I would expect that those individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders who also had adverse childhood experiences would also, they would also be negatively impacted in the long term by those experiences. it's a great question and point.
Thank you. I think we have time for just two more questions before we wrap up. This one comes from Vivian Moody. She says, great talk. Did you notice a significant difference between self-report and parent report? Now, I know that you mentioned at the very end of your talk, Christine, that might be an area for future research, but the other question related to this from Vivian is, do you see them as complementary or redundant?
So we did see a couple of differences. I didn't fully get into it. I didn't want to get into the weeds for our talk, but particularly related to like mental health. So, and specific to the autism group specifically. So young adults with autism and no cognitive impairments. With average or above average IQ, they tended to self-report significantly higher mental health symptoms than their parents even identified for them. In contrast, individuals with intellectual disability or autism and intellectual disability, they tended to report slightly fewer or lower mental health problems than their parents identified for them. And I think, so I don't see them as redundant at all. I definitely think they're both important information, as well as the, qualitative interview or clinical interviewing you would do in a clinical setting. I attribute some of that potentially, those with cognitive impairments may have less insight, or potentially there might be biases in parents reporting, such that parents' own view of, parents may report that their children are less satisfied with friendships because maybe they only have a couple of close friends, whereas the young adult themselves is pretty happy with that and feels pretty satisfied, but the parent thinks it's, is projecting like that. Since they wouldn't be happy with only having one or two close friends, they may make assumptions that their child might not be as happy as they are. So I definitely think there's more research to be done, and thinking too, there's some preliminary research around how you phrase the question to parents as they report changes how they report. So whether they report, from the perspective of your child, do you think that changes how they report? So more research.
Definitely more research needed in that area. There is, as you mentioned, a lot of research that shows that there are discrepancies often between parent and youth self-report, although there's also research that shows that those differences can lessen over the course of treatment, which is interesting. Okay, our last question is from Dr. Ariana Anderson, and she said, could you please give more examples of how you measured positive and negative parenting traits? Was parental over-involvement measured?
Yeah, so we measured it through a parent-child interaction coding system, the PCIRS, Parent-Child Interaction Rating System. And so at age 15, parents and their adolescent at the time were instructed to do kind of a joint problem-solving task, and we filmed them and then coded their behaviors. And so I would say, that intrusiveness, kind of gets at over-involvement of, whether the parent kind of took over the task or was really directive or critical, all of those things would have been captured with, or if they were, disengaged too, that would have been captured in that negative parenting. And then the positive parenting, behaviors like, providing scaffolding or support as needed, being encouraging, sensitive to, the adolescent's emotional state, if they were getting frustrated, being sensitive to that, as well as kind of asking questions or stimulating their thought process around the problem solving. So all of those things would be considered positive parenting in our coding system.
All right, well, thank you so much for answering those questions, Dr. Moody. We have unfortunately run out of time, but I do want to welcome our attendees. If you missed any portion of Dr. Moody's talk today or want to share it with others, this will be uploaded onto the UCLA Tarjan website. It'll be free to the public. Want to thank Dr. Moody once again for her really interesting insights and really fascinating research. We thank you so much for being a part of our lecture series. And to all of you, please stay safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next lecture. Thank you.